Ascending with Paul and humility. St. Paul gives us this story where he tells us of a man who ascends into what he calls paradise, or the third level of heaven. And in this story of going into heaven, Paul says, I don't even know if I was just in my body or if I was just in spirit. Only God knows. And he goes on to talk a little bit about himself. He says, the only thing that I will boast in, though, is that I'm weak. He said, though, even if I were to tell the story about ascending to God and being with God as God raptured me up, he said, even if I told that story, I wouldn't be boasting. I would just be telling the truth. So there's some interesting components here that St. Paul brings out about his experience of being raptured in God's presence. He talks about humility, and he talks about this experience. Now, Paul's not the first person to talk about a heavenly throne experience. In other words, being brought before the throne of God. There are other occasions, actually, of this happening. We read about, from the book of Genesis, that Enoch was a man of God. He walked with God and he was no more. Okay? And then, later on in what we call the intertestamental period, the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the books of Enoch are written about these stories of heavenly experiences, going into heaven and seeing the cosmos and seeing the universe and seeing God's throne. We also have the teaching of Ezekiel, who's directly in the presence of God and the cherubim and seraphim. We have the experience of Elijah, who's brought up to God in a fiery chariot. Now, I don't know if you know this, but there's an entire genre of literature called Markiba literature. It's all about fiery chariots, and these are writings that around the time of Christ that would have been populated among Jewish people about these experiences that people say could happen theoretically, that they want to happen. Oftentimes they're related to prayers that pious Jews would try to memorize, and they would attempt to experience by their repetition of certain prayers this Markiba tradition, this ascending into the throne room of God. St. John in the Apocalypse speaks about being brought into the presence of God. And so this is a pious tradition of the faith, and certainly an experience of saints. When you examine the kind of history of Christian spirituality, it's a very common mode to think about this ascension with God as Christ ascended to the right hand of the Father, and to desire to be there with Christ in the presence of His glory. St. John Climacus, of course, writes his Ladder of Divine Ascent, and there are plenty of books that talk about this ascension. Here I have today the work written by Bernard of Clairvaux, The Steps of Humility and Pride. And you can see on the front of this cover, this is a medieval writing, but you can see the depiction of St. John Climacus, his icon, the Ladder of Divine Ascent. That derives from the book of Genesis, chapter 28, where Jacob falls asleep. He lays his head upon a stone, and we're told that he has a dream. And he sees a ladder stretching from heaven to earth, and he says that he sees upon this ladder angels ascending and descending. And Yahweh speaks to him and says, the ground that you're standing is holy. And so this ladder of divine ascent, this experience of St. Paul, they're all one and the same thing. They're this mystical realm that exists somehow between us and God, and that's represented through ladders and through ascensions and through chariots. They're experiences of the saints that they have a hard time putting into precise words because they're beyond words. And so for this reason, St. Paul says that the things that he heard and saw when he was brought to the third level of heaven, he says, I can't actually put them into words. So there's some kind of experience which is beyond beyond what we call discursive reasoning or experiential reasoning. This kind of experience of reasoning is beyond anything that you and I have interacted with on the created order. And so there's a hard way. It's hard for these saints to come up with human analogies. In other words, human expressions and experiences that correlate with the type of experience they had. So here's the insight that St. Paul gives us and Bernard of Clairvaux wants to write about that I want to talk to you about. And that's that if we want to experience the ascent with God, we have to first have humility. Humility, in fact, when you read these steps of humility, he talks about these many, many steps, over 30 steps, and he says that each of them, well, it's kind of hard. He calls them, they're kind of rungs on a ladder. But each of them is just different levels of humility. And he doesn't actually experience anything other than each of the steps being humility until he's actually in the presence of God. And then he says, that's love. He calls that the second step. And the third step is contemplation. But the first step, which is just all of the rungs on a ladder, is just humility. That's all it is. Which is really insightful, right? Because, well, what is he saying? Well, he's saying that if you want to ascend to be with God, you need to have humility, because that's going to be the thing you need all along the way to get you there. That's really important, isn't it, then? And that's really consistent in the writing of the church fathers. They're all very consistent on this matter that you need humility to be with God, but they're also really consistent that last step of love, of being in the presence of God, is not something that we can do on our own. That's the work of God. So it's only a work of God to rapture us up to his presence. Only God can make that decision. But until then, he can work on our humility and we can work on our humility. So here's just a little excerpt where St. Bernard of Clairvaux is talking about St. Paul's ascent. He says, Paul must have passed through these 3 degrees when, as he tells us, he was wrapped up to the third heaven. Why does he use the word wrapped, not led? It is a lesson for me. If the great apostle had to be transported to the place which he could not know by his own learning or climb to by his own strength, even with a guide, then I, so tiny compared to Paul, must never presume that I can climb to the third heaven by my own strength and effort. He goes on to say that it needs to be the Lord. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about St. Paul. I think Bernard's making a really relevant point. Let's talk a little bit about St. Paul and see if we can agree together that humility is our best foot forward. Okay? St. Paul, he says, I don't even know if I was in body or in spirit when I was raptured before the Lord. So St. Paul, first, he professes his ignorance of the very experience that he had, an experience beyond anything that you and I have ever encountered. He says, I don't even get what just happened to me. Okay, I so don't get it. I'm so disoriented. I don't even know if my body was there or not. That's pretty disoriented. Right? If I say, where were you yesterday? And you say, I'm not sure where my body was. You're admitting some disorientation, right? St. Paul says that he was there, but he says, I can't even, this is not even me bragging. I'm just telling you the truth that the only thing that I can brag about is that I'm nothing at all. That's profound. What do you mean? The only thing you can brag about is that you're nothing at all. Well, that's a discovery. He's bragging about a discovery about himself. He's discovered something really important, that he's nothing at all. See, the only way that God could rapture him is if he realized he was nothing at all. And most of us, as you know, go through life thinking that we're something. And if we're not something, then we'd really like to be something. But we never really think about, what if I were nothing? And what if I just understood that I have nothing to add to this thing. I have nothing to bring to the table, but realizing that I'm nothing at all. I'm broken. St. Paul says that's the only thing, if I could brag, I'd brag about that. I'd say, yeah, I'm nothing. God's made me aware of that. That's profound, because you think he's the great apostle. He's been raptured into heaven. Clearly he's something. I mean, he's got to be better than the rest of us, because if not, why in the world would God take him to heaven? Well, the answer is, St. Paul says, it's because I realize I'm nothing. And probably we haven't. And you think that Paul would be humble by this point? He says that God sent him a demon, basically, to torture his flesh. We don't know exactly what that is. Some can speculate it might be his eyes, or people speculate all kinds of things. But we know that he was somehow tormented in his physical flesh, and that he begged God 3 times to take it from him. But God said, I'm not taking it from you, Paul, because in your weakness, my strength is made perfect. God's like, hey, Paul, yeah, you're right. You got it down. Your being nothing is what you got to keep being, though. So let's stick with it. Because Paul's even tempted to go and say, I'd like to be something. God, this kind of stinks being nothing. He goes, no, we got to keep you there, Paul. We got to keep you being nothing. It's the only way this is going to work out in the end. And you think Paul wouldn't need that? Because if you actually examine Paul's life, he had every reason to also know that he was nothing. I mean, if you read Corinthians, Paul says, I've been shipwrecked 3 times. I've beat to death a bunch of times. People despise me. And the churches that I found, they don't even pay me. Like they're always arguing with me. All right, I have to constantly argue with the other bishops, which is no fun, right? St. Paul had to go make tents because he couldn't even afford to live based on, when he gave his entire life for the gospel, right? St. Paul went through a lot of difficulty. In fact, remember when he first comes to the Lord, and Paul was a murderer, as we all know, and Agabus the prophet is talking to God and says, I don't want to go help out this murderer Saul. You hear how he's persecuting the church. And God says, don't worry, Agabus. Paul's going to suffer for me. Don't worry, Agabus. Paul's going to go through the ringer. Okay? You don't need to hold on to your vengeance. So Agabus listens, and Paul does. He goes through an incredibly difficult time. He's in chains, and eventually he has his head chopped off, of course. But Paul passes on something very important to us to understand that if we want to be with God, we have to learn humility. You guys know the phrase. How many humble people are in hell? 0 people who are humble are in hell. How many prideful people are in heaven? 0. Oh, then there's a common variable here. Okay? If 0 prideful people are in heaven and 0 humble people are in hell, we have an important variable to discuss. Right? This is the common theme of what we need to grasp so that we wind up in heaven. And the answer that Paul gives us here in this text is humility. And it's the answer that every saint has ever given. Humility. Humility is the means by which we're going to move forward and actually find ourselves, through God's abundant grace, raptured into His presence. I'll give you the best definition I can come up with on what humility is. And I didn't come up with it like out of thin air. This is like a combination of different fathers and Bonaventure and Aquinas and my reading of Scripture. So it's really my attempt to pull it all together. Here's what I would say humility is. I would say that it's a virtue by which one willingly knows who he is in relation to God's will and acts accordingly. I'll say that again. I think that humility is a virtue by which one willingly knows who he is in relation to God's will and acts accordingly. So I'll just break that down a little bit for you. So the most perfect act of humility we're told about in Philippians chapter 2. That's when God the Word becomes incarnate through Jesus Christ. And we're told he humbles himself. Well, Jesus should not humble himself in the strict sense. Like, it makes sense for us to say, yeah, we should humble ourselves. But how can we talk about Jesus humbling himself? Because he doesn't need to do it. Well, here's the thing. Jesus knows exactly who he is. He's the Word of God. He knows exactly how men need to be saved by him lowering himself. He knows that it's only going to happen by coming and showing us how to be saved, dying on a cross, showing us what that life looks like. And so he acts upon the will of God by doing so. See? Now, that definition works for Jesus. That's why I like it, because it works for Jesus and it works for us. See, here's what we've got to do. It's a bit different than the way Jesus did it, but it's the same words, okay? We want to willingly know who we are. That's the start. Okay? We want to know who we are, meaning we want to compare ourselves to a standard that doesn't vary. Okay, so if I say to you, are you a good person? And you don't know God, you know what you're going to do? You're going to say, in your mind, in comparison to Hitler, doing pretty good. That's what you're going to do. You're going to compare yourself to someone less than yourself. This is the human tendency of self-preservation. We will do anything we can to preserve ourselves from having to feel the pain of consciousness or the pain of feeling lesser, because we are trained, and we train ourselves all of our lives, how to think more highly of ourselves, so that we don't have to work through the pain of conscience, the pain of weakness, the pain of insufficiency. We choose to not compare ourselves to God. And if we do compare ourselves to God, we always have the backup plan. I'll compare myself to God only if I get to compare everybody else at the same time to God. Because once again, I need to feel okay about myself. See? So, even if I say I'll compare myself to God, I say, but you lot have to come with me. See, what we're doing is actually not comparing ourselves to God. We're still comparing ourselves to everyone around us. So you see, there has to be a willingness to come before God and say, God, you show me who I am in comparison to you. And the problem is that once we do that, it hurts a lot. It hurts a lot. And we usually can't bear it for very long, because we realize quite quickly that we are just selfish little animals, selfish little beasts, like thoroughly selfish through and through. We're thinking about ourselves all the time, and it's almost impossible to stop being egocentric. It's really a difficult task, and most people won't even try not to be egocentric. They'll just go right on through with it to the end of their life, not realizing that they never even knew themselves at all because they were so busy thinking about themselves all the time. Do you hear what I'm saying? If you think about yourself all the time, then you're thinking about a creature that's falling apart. Your brain is shrinking as you get older, not getting smarter, all right? Our bodies are getting weaker. Our memories start getting dementia. We start getting angry and feisty. We don't get better. In other words, we're comparing ourselves against a creature that's falling apart more and more every day. Now, what kind of standard is that? That's a really unreliable standard, right? If I want to talk to you about something that persists, I'm not going to bring up the analogy of grass. It's here one day, the sun arises, it gets burnt up, and it's gone tomorrow. That's a stupid analogy. That's a stupid comparison if I want to talk about something that persists. The ultimate analogy is to talk about God in relation to us. So, this is why it only makes sense to compare ourselves to God, because only God persists. Everything else is beggarly and weak and vain and passing away. St. David said, all men are liars. It's true, every man. None of us are reliable. To the least bit, we're all very flimsy things. So we compare ourselves to God. Okay, now, when we willingly, I take it on, I'll compare myself to you, do that. What happens is we realize I have nothing to bring to the table. Even what I have to bring to the table, as piddly as it is something that was given to me. I didn't bring my own life into this world. Nor can I control what happens after my body dies. I have very little real control. Now, on top of that, I'm morally corrupt to the core. I have a tendency towards all kinds of depravities. Now, if I can bring that to the Lord, and I can say, Lord, I want to admit that that's who I am. Now, in relationship to your God, to your will, I want to live my life. Well, then we've made the step towards actually walking in real humility. I want to take my nothingness and I want to use it for your glory. Which isn't a very fair exchange, because what that means is we're telling God, here's my trash, can you do anything with it? But that's the exchange. That is the exchange. And if we don't think that's the exchange, then God's not really, he's getting a worse exchange. Because we're telling him, God, here's my gold, and he's looking at it going, you sure you want to call that your gold? That's your gold? Okay, let's go back to the drawing table. More humbling experiences in your life. You're not quite ready to give me a thing yet. Because as long as you're bringing me your gold, you're not yet ready to give me anything. Because humility requires honesty. And honesty requires truth. It means that we have to have a real understanding of what we're bringing God. And it's nothing at all. It's nothing. Until we get to that point, we're going to think we're offering God something. And we're going to confuse ourselves. And we're going to have to keep being humbled again and again. So God, in his great mercy, even had to keep humbling St. Paul with a thorn in his flesh. Do you think he'll have to humble you again and again? Do you think so? Everything will have to be stripped, which we think we have to offer God. Right? If we don't do it on our own, don't worry, death will do it for you. If you don't do it on your own, death will do it for sure. But hopefully you'll learn. Because then you can have a wonderful relationship with God. Love. That is what we're aiming for. It's not just about beating ourselves up. What we want is to actually receive God's love and to realize that love that he's given to us is completely free. It's completely God's grace. There's nothing we can do to earn it. The only thing that we can earn is realizing that we didn't earn anything. Then we have God's grace. By his free gift. Remember what Saint Bernard of Clairvaux is saying. Paul didn't rapture himself up. God raptured him. He could not bring himself there. It's only God's gift. So we bring him nothing. And we have nothing to offer him. And we honestly say, here's my nothing that I'm offering you. And then, by his grace, if he so chooses, he freely raptures us to himself and offers us his love. But we have to be brought to a place where we're willing to honestly examine ourselves in light of God and to say, God, I take this garbage of myself and I ask you that somehow it be placed at the service of your will. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.